Science, as a system of knowledge production following principles of the scientific method, promises that findings will be independent from the idiosyncratic characteristics of a single researcher. A study deserves our trust if it results from the proper application of scientific procedures, because other researchers should come to the same results and conclusions when following them. Or not. Recently, scholars systematically attempting to verify and reproduce the procedures employed by others struggled to produce the same or even similar findings, calling into question the credibility of several fields of science. In response, scientists increasingly engaged in identifying threats to the reliability of the scientific process. They push researchers toward interesting, satisfying, or spectacular results that are not necessarily accurate or reliable. This leads to the logical conclusion that research freed from these distorting pressures will generate more reliable research findings. The results of this study lead us to conclude that systematically distorted research practices are only one part of the problem. We find that idiosyncratic variation inherent to the scientific process is also a factor making research non-replicable or lacking in consensus. This means there is researcher variability that will manifest despite rigidity of adherence to ethics and the scientific method. Even well-meaning scientists freed from pressure to distort results and provided with identical data to analyze may not produce convergent findings because of the complexity and ambiguity inherent to the process of scientific analysis. Any scientific analysis confronts researchers with a multiplicity of seemingly minor decision points. As any decision point may introduce variability in research outcomes, every step of the research process should be seen as non-trivial. Some researchers suggest that the freedom to specify plausible pipelines for data analysis is so vast that basically any, even highly implausible results, can be produced. These findings suggest that idiosyncratic researcher variability in data analytical choices, even after removing biasing structures, may pose a much greater challenge to reliable scientific findings than scientists have long believed. Scientists only recently began to systematically assess the process of data analysis. Many of these studies were quite small in scale, focused on field-specific methodologies, or were conducted intentionally outside of a researcher's standard ecological setting or knowledge. One study in this area had a sizable sample of 70 analysts, and the principal investigators could explain most of the broad variation in their analysts' outcomes as a result of model specifications. This suggests to us that even if many researchers come to different results via the data analysis pipeline, a meta-analysis of their work should provide a means for filtering or better understanding the outcomes. Or so we thought. We designed a study to make the analytical process as observable as possible. We coordinated a large group of data analysts to simultaneously but independently test a common social science research hypothesis related to a pressing real-world problem of this historical period. Although all researchers worked with identical data and hypothesis, we find that their empirical results and substantive conclusions vary widely. We expected variance, however, we believed in advance that we would be able to explain at least a meaningful range of this variance. The participants were asked to test an identical hypothesis with the condition that they draw data from a specific international survey and limit their analysis to a single module from that survey containing 6 questions asking about the government's responsibility to provide social security or social welfare across various domains as an outcome of 2 test variables. One was the stock of immigrants per country, and the other was the flow of immigrants into that country in the past year. The researchers were given tasks to familiarize them with the topic of the study and to develop their own ideal test models, which they pre-registered with us before conducting their main analyses. A total of 73 teams completed the main analysis. There was an average of 2.2 researchers per team, meaning 162 researchers in total, and there was a 76% completion rate, meaning that of the 106 teams that volunteered to take part in the study, only 73 teams finished all tasks. They submitted statistical code, numerical results, and subjective conclusions. 5 different software languages were used: Stata, R, SPSS, MLWin, and M+. We tested all code for replicability and then redacted any identifying features in the code for public sharing. We ensured extraction of average marginal effects, calculated as the average of the differences between 2 predicted values for all cases in the sample. This was based on a 1-point difference in the test variable, and all other independent variables left at their real values for each case. This is identical to a regression coefficient for linear models. They were required to draw one of 3 subjective conclusions. A, the hypothesis was supported. Immigration reduces support for social policy. B, rejected. Immigration does not reduce support. Or C, it was not testable. In other words, the results, data, models, or some other part of the research process rendered the tests invalid or inconclusive in the opinion of the team. Some of the team's preferred models did not converge, leaving 1,253 results, which are plotted in the figure here. They are plotted by average marginal effect from lowest to highest point estimate. The green bars and the red bars indicate a negative and a positive effect that is significantly different from 0 with 95% confidence. Green associates with negative because this would indicate empirical support, or at least potential empirical support, of the hypothesis that immigration has a negative effect on social policy preferences. What we find most striking about this figure is the broad range of results and a lack of tendency toward any particular result. In this next figure, we order results by the minimum of the confidence interval. For negative effects, this is the upper boundary, and for positive effects, this is the lower boundary. The protruding lines are the confidence intervals associated with each point estimate, and they are of very different lengths. This demonstrates that the confidence intervals vary widely across teams, just like the point estimates. The 2 previously shown specification curves are now placed side by side in panels A and B. The lower panels C and D present the distribution of 4 team characteristics aggregated from each individual team member's response to a participant survey conducted during the research process. This survey asked questions about their prior belief that the hypothesis is true, whether they have pro-immigration attitudes, whether they have prior knowledge of the study's subject matter, and the strength of their statistical skills. The 5th and lowest bar in the 2 lower panels represents a subjective model scoring. After the teams submitted their models, but before we shared other teams' results with the participants, we asked each participant to rank 3 to 4 models on their quality. The 5 measures in the lower panels C and D are created using a rolling average of 10 models at a time. This provides an opportunity to visualize any potential patterns we might see in the data. There are no strong patterns, as we will show in our regression analyses. However, you can see perhaps a slight trend. For example, in panel D, the models with the highest score, the lightest color blue, tend to cluster towards the middle. In the lower 2 panels of the figure, we now present some model specifications. Here we have immigration test operationalization, the lighter blue bars, and immigration test measurement, the darker blue bars. Operationalization is the strategy of testing for the variable measuring immigration. This could take on level of immigrants, stock, change in the number of immigrants, flow, or a derivative of the change in flow. For measurement, the variable could be taken as a percentage of the population that are immigrants, or net migration, which is the difference between the in and out migration in the past year. Again, what is striking here is that there is no particular pattern by model specification. Here we plot the choice of dependent variable in the lower panel. Some teams elected to create a scale out of some or all of the variables. Here some very slight patterns emerge. For example, models using the dependent variable jobs tend toward a negative effect. Models using the variable for unemployment tend toward a positive effect. But these are very slight, and again, results can range all the way across the spectrum. This next specification curve reveals the subjective conclusions of each of the teams. Some teams treated their immigration test operationalizations as independent tests. This led to 16 teams that reported 2 different conclusions. This was most often a different conclusion applying to stock versus flow models. In total, 53 team conclusions rejected the hypothesis, while 23 team conclusions supported the hypothesis. The remaining few concluded that the hypothesis was not testable. Although the rejected hypotheses have a slim majority, this in no way appears to us as a consensus. Moreover, we cannot explain this variation in subjective conclusions using the characteristics of the researchers shown in the lower panel, or the model score on the very lowest bar of the lower panel. Also interesting about this figure is that in the top bar below the specification curve, we report the percentage of positive test results. These are empirical effect sizes that are positive and significantly different from 0 with 95% confidence. You can see that those supporting the hypothesis are more likely to have positive test results, but the pattern is not perfect. As we will see in the next figure, in fact, this can only explain about 30% of the deviance in subjective conclusions by team. In order to compare models systematically, we identified model specifications using qualitative hand coding from the team's submitted software syntax. We sought to identify every feature of every model, except for software defaults that cannot be identified from the code itself. We identified 166 model specifications. Of these, 107 were common across teams, meaning they occurred in at least 3 of the teams. When compared, these model specifications led to 1,261 unique models out of 1,261 submitted models. We next regressed these average marginal effects and subjective conclusions on the common model specifications that we identified across teams using multi-level regression models. We report next the percentage of the variance in the case of average marginal effects and the deviance in the case of subjective conclusions reduced at each level when adding variables measuring objective conditions, the purple bars, common model specifications, the green bars, and researcher characteristics, the blue bars. The unexplained variance that remains, the salmon-colored bars, is a product of the idiosyncratic decisions or actions taken by each team when constructing each of their models. In all cases, the 107 common model specifications only uniquely explain a maximum of 11% of the variance between teams and only 3% of the variance within teams in terms of average marginal effects. The characteristics of the researchers explains a further 4% and 1% respectively. Although we made no concrete numerical predictions in advance, we expected that we could explain a majority or at least a lot of the variance in results based on the model specifications of each team. This is not the case here, unless we consider each team and each model unique. Then of course we can explain the remaining idiosyncratic variance. We were surprised to discover that what we considered to be the major factors in data analysis relating to sample selection, measurement, test design, equation components, choice of estimator, that were common in the designs of at least 3 teams and standard in the state-of-the-art research on this topic to which we are familiar, they just do not explain much. In our crowdsourced experiment, the uniqueness of each team's models was striking because it led to unique results independent of common model features. Interesting but minor point. Teams were more likely to conclude support if their sample included rich democracies only, did not include a variable for GDP, and used OLS estimation. In other words, they did not use a multi-level model. But we should be very clear that this explains less than 5% of the deviance in subjective conclusions and should not distract us from our main results. Visualized in this figure, these are the main findings. We simply cannot explain much of the variance in results. Even the percentage of positive test results, a somewhat empirical measure, do not explain much of the subjective conclusions, only about 30%. There still remains 50% unexplained variance. We performed 2 checks of our analyses. We ran the models separately for each dependent variable, and we used a dredge function to compare every possible combination of model specifications. Neither of these led to any particularly informative insights. The main findings held. Working with data after they were collected is often seen as the most objective step in the scientific process. However, we see it as an underappreciated fact that researchers can take many different paths in wrangling, analyzing, presenting, and interpreting their data. We conclude that, at least in some research fields, the results of a scientific study involving analysis of data depends on idiosyncratic decisions taken by the researchers. Put another way, across researchers there are meta forms of unreliability that are not related to questionable research practices or perverse incentives, as these factors were largely removed from the research process in our study. This is strong evidence that results would differ even if theory, hypotheses, and data do not. If a study had been conducted by different researchers, perhaps even the same researchers at a different time, results are prone to researcher variability. Our study adds to a growing awareness that a key job of scientists is to not only communicate our best beliefs about a phenomenon of interest, but also to systematically assess how confident we can be in these beliefs. One limitation of our study is generalizability. We simply cannot say how much researcher variability would impact analyses in other areas, for example, in experimental data where the data generating model is much clearer to the analyst. It is theoretically possible that these data are simply not appropriate for testing the hypothesis at hand. We cannot know this for sure, but if it were true, it might explain some of the variation in results in subjective conclusions. Nonetheless, we feel confident that we should be able to still explain variance in results based on the model specifications of the teams. It is striking that we cannot explain much variance, and this speaks directly to the idiosyncratic features of the researchers in this process. Finally, a limitation and a suggestion. This process seems to entail an explicit lack of theory, the data analytic process. What we'd like to point out is that plausible, seemingly inconsequential data analytic decisions should be held up to stronger theoretical scrutiny. Decisions that seem benign at the time, such as dichotomizing a variable or changing estimators, may have assumptions that have deep implications for causality or theory. In this sense, we suggest that a focus on theory and attention to the fact that every decision, whether taken consciously or even unconsciously, and whether explicit or implicit, matters. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention and welcome your questions.